I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 33rd installment of this podcast dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any and all means necessary. This is another Smart Drug Smarts morning edition, or at least I'm recording the segments around this episode first thing in the morning as soon as I get up with my brain very fresh and in fact pre-caffeinated, pre-hydrated, pre-anything. Somebody mentioned that it would be great to have sort of a rundown at the beginning of each show, what pharmaceuticals are in my system as of any particular episode, and I think I might start doing that. Yeah, right now that we're starting at a zero baseline. Last time I had anything whatsoever of interest was a couple of fish oil capsules before I went to bed last night. And this morning we are going to be talking about adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue is an interesting concept. It's a matter of some debate. This is not something which you're going to find everybody agreeing on. There are some doctors that'll tell you adrenal fatigue is not a real thing, doesn't really exist, is sort of giving medical terminology to something which is not a thing unto itself. We're going to be talking with one of the pros on adrenal fatigue, one of the people that is on the pro side of the coin, a guy named Dr. James Wilson, who's been a long-standing champion of adrenal fatigue, A, being a real thing, and B, being a manageable thing. And he's going to be talking with us about what he prescribes for the management of adrenal fatigue. And probably at some point later in the future, we'll have somebody from the con side of the coin to kind of give the opposite end of the spectrum. Because as a Smart Drug Smarts listener and somebody who might push the limits of things with caffeine or other stimulants that you're trying to milk the most out of yourself, we're the sort of audience that would be banging our heads into adrenal fatigue if in fact it is a real thing. So it's something that you want to have an opinion on, and today should be an opinion-forming episode for people. Also, if you hang out until the end of the episode, I will tell you how to get your very own bottle of popular and effective stimulant, caffeine. In fact, a caffeine and L-theanine mix called Green Tea Focus. I'm going to be giving away a couple of bottles of Green Tea Focus from the makers of Green Tea Focus, and I will tell you how to get in the running for those bottles at the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick. But before we get into any of that, we shall do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So this is pretty cool. This is something that excites the tech geek in me. There's a new website that was put together by a couple of MIT doctoral students called OpenEphys. I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's EPHYS, and I'm assuming they mean ephys like physics. But what this is it's a open source site for people that are building hardware to do study into neuroscience projects. So turns out there's not a lot of off-the-shelf commercial components that you can use when you're doing neuroscience research. And so oftentimes people that are putting together studies into neuroscience, they wind up kind of rolling their own technical doohickeys to run their tests. And then these get used for whatever particular experiment they're doing, and oftentimes then sit on a shelf, collect dust, and are not really built with sort of design principles like modularity or component reusability or stuff like that, because they're all essentially viewed as one-offs. Which means you got a lot of really, really smart people that are doing these experiments, but kind of wasting those, smart brain CPU cycles to reinvent a lot of wheels that might be useful to other neuroscience researchers and other labs across the country or the world or whatever. So OpenEphys is kind of a shared open source resource for people that are in the field of neuroscience study and that are sort of trying to draw information from their collective peer group to save them all time and benefit everybody in better understanding the brain. So very cool stuff. They've got a neat little website. There's not too much on it yet because it's pretty new, but it's worth checking out, and it's pretty inspiring that this is getting underway. And of course, we will have a link to this on our Smart Drug Smarts website.
Smart Drug Smarts.
All right, let's head straight into our main interview now with Dr. James L. Wilson, PhD, DC, and MD. Several different doctorates, in fact, 3 doctorates following his name. The DC and the MD are for chiropractic and naturopathic medicine, if I'm not mistaken, whereas the PhD is human nutrition from the University of Arizona. Dr. Wilson is the man behind adrenalfatigue.org, which is one of the main websites devoted to this topic, and has also written the book, Adrenal Fatigue, the 21st Century Stress Syndrome. So let's dive straight into this interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Adrenal fatigue is, in simple terms, the underfunction of the adrenals. Now, it can happen during a normal day. It can happen under times of moderate or even severe stress. So what happens? Let's just go back a little further. The adrenals are 2 glands that sit over the kidneys, thus their name, adrenal, over the kidneys. And they're 2 little glands that about the size of a large grape, but they secrete over 50 hormones. These hormones circulate through your body, and in 1856, they were found by a famous physician called Charles Brown-Secord to be necessary for life. He took the adrenals out of some dogs, and he found the dogs were able to only maintain for a day or two before they succumbed. And so that stimulated a certain amount of research in the adrenals, and they thought for almost 50 in about 2001. There were two fellows that shared a Nobel Prize that isolated the hormone called epinephrine, or norepinephrine, used to be called uh,
Adrenaline, yeah.
adrenaline or noradrenaline. They thought they had the secret, but the unfortunate thing is there is a disease that's a failure of the adrenal glands called Addison's disease. And when they gave this epinephrine or norepinephrine to these patients, they didn't do very well. And it took another quarter of a century before different physicians, they were able to isolate another series of hormones, especially one eventually called cortisol. It went through several different names before it finally rested on that name, cortisol. And then in about 1949, they started giving injections at the Mayo Clinic and watching what happens. And the kind of the defining experiment was when they took a woman with rheumatoid arthritis and came in a wheelchair, and they gave her an injection of, we don't know exactly how much, cortisol, and she got up and walked. And they said, oh my God, it's a miracle. So it became one of those miracle drugs. And it took about 5 years before they realized that cortisol had some side effects. During this time, doctors knew that there was a problem with the adrenal glands, and there were adrenal cortical extracts available, the whole adrenal cortical extracts, and sometimes it had the medulla removed and just the cortex was used. And there were at least three companies in England. There was Chase Ramey, Burroughs Wellcome. There was a huge pharmaceutical company, and another one. And then by 1917 in the U.S., then Henry Harwer, who was the first editor of the Journal of Endocrinology, had a lab that produced a dietary supplement called Adrenal Spermin that was a combination of adrenal and testicular extract.
And were they getting this out of pigs, or what were they doing to actually?
They could get them, it depended on the researcher, they could get them from sheep or bovine sources, which would be cattle,
Okay.
or porcine, which is pig. And then there were a few that got them from oxen and a couple from buffalo. But for the most part, they were from either sheep or pig or bovine. So the majority of them, because of the ease of working with them and the abundance, came from bovine. So the cow was the most important source.
Mm-hmm.
By the time that mid-20s came around, every major pharmaceutical company, so Parke-Davis and Upjohn and Wilson and all the major pharmaceutical companies, were making the adrenal extracts along with other glandular extracts. And they were one of the best sellers. So they were really going on, such that in 1937, Harwer reports that these were being used by tens of thousands of physicians to treat different adrenal problems. And this low adrenal function was being reported since 1898. Emile Sargent, a French physician, reported this in a group of patients who, there was a severe flu going through France, and he noticed that there was a certain subgroup of these patients who had the severe flu who just didn't get over it. They took a lot longer, and they got sick easier, and they had this nausea in their stomach, and they were so tired, and especially had it the afternoon low. And he found that if he used these adrenal extracts and some salted water, that they did quite a bit better. And so then we can find that Sejau in 1909, from about 1909 to 1925, was writing about these in his several volumes, and Brown-Secord talked about it, and Henry Harwer in 1916 started writing about it on his organotherapy book, and then Harwer in a 1923 separate book started writing about it, and different people started writing about this, and it became fairly well known. And so a lot of doctors were treating it had different names. It was sometimes called small Addisons, or little Addisons, or adrenal hypoadrenia, or mild hypoadrenia, because the problem is that adrenal insufficiency, as it was sometimes also called, that's what they also called Addison's disease. So there's some confusion of terms. But in this case, Addison's disease is a disease where in the industrialized world, it's usually due to an autoimmune function, and the adrenal gland is eaten away in most cases. In non-industrialized nations, in rural areas. Tuberculosis is the most common cause, or some other form of infectious disease. Now, you can also get tuberculosis, chlamydia, AIDS can also eat away at the adrenal gland. So there's a few pathogens that can kill it, can eat away at the adrenal gland. And the interesting thing is that almost 90% of the adrenal gland usually has to be destroyed before the people actually feel it. But
Wow.
once they do, then of course it's fairly rapid, the descent. And if they don't get it in time, then the person will often die. Not always, but often die. Adrenal fatigue is a very different kind of animal, because even though it affects the adrenals, it seems to be a functional rather than a structural problem. In other words, the adrenals don't get eaten away by a disease or an autoimmune process. They're still there intact, except they just can't function like they're supposed to. So someone starts to do something, they need that extra push of the cortisol and the other hormones, and it just doesn't come to them. Now, how's that affect us? What people don't know, and a matter of fact, unfortunately, a lot of medical doctors don't know, is that cortisol is necessary to maintain your blood sugar. So without cortisol, there's a process called gluconeogenesis that can't happen.
Hmm.
Now, cortisol does a tremendous number of things in our body. Someone should write a poem or a song ode to cortisol, because it does so much to help people. But in this case, it helps fatty acids and peptides and proteins be converted into blood glucose in the liver and in skeletal muscle. So it is made from, it takes such fatty acids and peptides and converts them into blood sugar. Now, if the body needs them, it goes right into the bloodstream and is used. If it doesn't need them, then it goes into storage, and the cortisol is once again necessary to make substance called glycogen that gets stored in the liver.
Hmm.
Now, it's interesting because cortisol is glycogen is simply two glucose molecules stuck on the end of each other, just two stuck together. And cortisol is necessary for that. In times of stress, one of the first things that people need is more energy inside their cells. Why? Because they need more of a substance called ATP, because ATP is the energy that most cells use in order to function correctly. Unfortunately, the ATP is used up, and in the times of low adrenal function, the blood sugar is used up fairly rapidly. Insulin goes up quite nicely, and insulin is that key that gets the blood sugar into the cell. But then we've got enough insulin, but we don't have enough blood sugar because it gets used and it's not replaced, because there's not enough glycogen reserve and there's not enough cortisol to remake this gluconeogenesis to get the fatty acids to convert into blood glucose. So the person suffers from low blood sugar during these times when they need it most. So if you take the old analogy of being chased by a lion, about the time they see the lion and take two steps, they're starting to run on empty. So not a very good scenario. So in our, what we find in our modern day, and being a little bit more practical, is that we find that cortisol is necessary for you to feel nice and refreshed when you get up in the morning. And so if that cortisol, which has its low around 4:30 in the morning and rises up about 45 minutes before you usually rise, doesn't start up and get up, you don't feel like you should get up.
Hmm.
So that draggy feeling in the morning, oh God, the day came again. That's cortisol. A lot of times not being where. Now, I'm not going to say that's the only thing, but it's the most common thing we see. And then right after, with people with weak adrenals, they might feel tired, but then they'll feel even worse as the day goes on, a lot of times up until they have their first meal or they get something in their system. So people learn to kind of medicate themselves. So they learn that if they have a cup of strong coffee, or two or three or four cups of strong coffee, especially some sugary donuts or something like that, that'll help get that blood sugar up and get them going again. And then, of course, about 9:30 or 10, they need something else. So they have another cup of Java or a Red Bull or some Mountain Dew, something with a lot of caffeine in it. They can keep going, Jolt, something. And then they'll have another Bear Claw or Twist or some other food that's quickly metabolized to get up.
Right. Kind of
And
keep
then,
spiking their sugar throughout the day.
yeah,
So,
that's right. That's exactly what happens, because we know that that sugar has about an hour and a half most before it's going to start going down. And when you have that much sugar and that much caffeine, then you cause that insulin to over-secrete. And so it overdoes it. It spills over into the urine and gets it into the cells as fast as possible. And all of a sudden, they're running on empty again. So they finally make it to noon, they eat, and then a lot of times they'll feel better after their noon meal. And so they kind of make it through the morning. And those sugary and caffeine drinks, not the best for them, but they kind of help them medicate their way through till noon. They eat a meal and they feel better. And then about 2:30 or 3, somewhere in the mid-afternoon, it might be 4 or 4:30, they start getting a low. And that low can be as gentle as, geez, I just don't feel like doing too much right now. I think I'll just kind of doodle here at my desk instead of getting the work done, all the way to I got to lay down. I got to lay down. I got to go do something. Just kind of get out of here for half an hour or so and flake out somewhere. So it can last up to an hour and a half, sometimes even 2 hours for these people. They get past the mid-afternoon, then it's a strange thing. It's like around 6 o'clock, it's like this magic switch goes on. It's like someone turns this magic button. All of a sudden, they feel better. It corresponds with an eating meal, so if they eat around that time, they feel usually even better. But there's a switch that happens with cortisol there, and so they'll go on 9:30. They might get kind of tired, but a lot of these people are Type A people, so they push themselves beyond that 9:30 because they've also learned if they get to about 11 o'clock at night, they're going to get a second wind, and then they'll feel good and stable, and they'll go till 1:30 or 2. They'll be able to read that book, get that project done, be able to do that extra stuff and write if they're a writer. They get stay up, they'll find the best writings about that time. And then about 1:30 or 2, they get sleepy, they go to bed. And then if they're astute, they notice that if they can sleep in the next morning and about an hour and a half or 2 hours after they'd usually get up, they feel so much better. Wow, I feel so much better if I get up during this time. This is cortisol because if that cortisol doesn't have to peak, or that you don't have to use up all that extra cortisol to get up and get going and simply can lie down and let that cortisol small peak pass, you feel much better after about an hour and a half or 2 hours of resting in. So this peak, this particular energy pattern is really important to notice with adrenal fatigue. Feeling tired when you get up, and then not wanting a cup of coffee or cola, but having to get something into me before I can function, that kind of feeling.
Hmm.
And then oftentimes a mid-morning low, doing much better after a noon meal, and then having the afternoon low, feeling better around 6 o'clock, having that second wind around 11 o'clock. That is a very typical picture of people with low adrenal functions. And it's been described since the 1920s. So what I did is
Let me interrupt with one question, actually, first.
Sure.
So we talked about how Addison's disease is based on like structural problems within the adrenal glands. Within adrenal fatigue, what's happening? What is the actual scientific physiological reason why the adrenal glands aren't being able to pump out as much adrenaline as they should be able to under normal circumstances?
In most cases, it's because the nutrients aren't there. If they've pushed themselves too far, what looks like has happened is that there's some damage that's happened, some minor damage. So, rather than just use a World War II analogy, instead of the plane being shot down, it just gets dinged and it's got some holes in it, but it's able to cruise back to the landing site. So it didn't. Whereas it doesn't get shot down like the adrenals get destroyed. It simply gets minor damage. So function is affected. And then the nutrients are used up like crazy, so that there's particular nutrients that need to be given in much larger quantities than most people can consume them once you get into a state of adrenal fatigue. And so they have to be replaced. So that they're in a need of much more nutrient than they can get on the usual kind of food, especially in North America with the kind of diet that most North Americans eat. There's no way they can replenish those. So I've had people that had my oldest, I think she was 78, and she'd had adrenal fatigue all of her life. Yeah, so you can get them. It's not unusual for me to have people that have had adrenal fatigue for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. And it doesn't mean they gradually go downhill and then can't function. Some go to a certain low level of function, and then they just adapt. They learn they can't push themselves. They learn they can't take on that much responsibility. They learn they can only handle a certain amount of stress. Now, there's others that can become quite incapacitated. I've had one medical doctor in Australia who became so weak she spent 2 weeks in the cardiac ICU. They never figured out what was wrong with her. She finally figured out herself what was wrong with her. I had another woman in New Zealand who was so weak she couldn't dress herself. And She got on, took our supplements and read my book, and in 2 years she climbed Machu Picchu and has since written a book on how to recover from adrenal fatigue.
Well, let me
And
ask for a sec. Other than self-graded questionnaire, is there a blood test, a something like that somebody could get that says physiologically, like, yes, this person does have adrenal fatigue, no, they don't? Like, let's say you find somebody in a coma and they can't answer questions. How would you be able to determine whether that person does or doesn't have adrenal fatigue?
absolutely, there are clinical tests. Now, 4 of those are given in the book, and so there's things, for example, the adrenals, because of another hormone called aldosterone that tends to drop with adrenal fatigue. Then, when someone is low adrenal function, they're often low in sodium. The interesting thing is it doesn't show up so much in the blood as it shows up in someone simply they feel better if they take a glass of salted water. But there are some clinical tests. Let's get back to the clinical test. They also had low blood pressure. So someone, if they lie on their back, take their blood pressure, stand up, take their blood pressure immediately. What should happen in a normal person is blood pressure should rise, both the top and bottom number should rise by about 10 millimeters of mercury, or about 10 points. And what happens in adrenal fatigue is it actually drops when they stand up. And so that's one indication. And if someone wants to do this, they can go to the drugstore and they can get a sphygmomanometer, and they can have they have the digital type now, so it'll do all the recording or printouts for you if you want to. And then the second test they can do is that they can go into a dark room and take a pin light and shine it across their eye, not into their eye because it can damage their eye, but across the eye. And then what they should notice as they look into a mirror is the iris should naturally contract, shouldn't it? Because that's the smallest muscle in the body, and it responds to light by contracting, so you get pupillary contraction. And then if you hold that pen light, what you see is it has difficulty holding that tightness. And instead of the pinpoint pupil, you'll see start to vacillate back and forth. And so in some of the more severe cases, around 2 minutes, it just dilates and is open, even though you've got a light shining across it. So that's the light test. Then for the more severe cases, lying on your back, this is a little hard to do yourself, but for docs, I instruct them to take the blunt end of the neurological hammer and draw it across the abdomen. And people at home, you can take the blunt end of a knife, fork, or spoon, the blunt end, okay,
Yeah.
the handle end,
Sure.
and pull it across with about 10 pounds of pressure over your abdomen. And what you should see is a pink line. What you'll see with adrenal fatigue is that turns either white or it'll be white with a pink outline. And that's usually the more severe 25% or so. And then if you lie that person on their back and you find the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are pretty easy to locate. If you can find the bottom rib, which is really easy, simply have someone breathe in, and as they breathe out, you go from their hips up with your thumbs together, and you'll find a place where there's resistance with your fingers. That's where the 12th rib is located. And then you find a little space just above that, about 2 inches above that, and have them breathe out. Go out, take your thumbs from that spinous process where your thumbs are, go out about an inch on each side, have them breathe in. And as they breathe out, you're between the 11th and 12th rib. So you're right above that place that was kind of firm, and there's a little soft spot there. And as you breathe out, you can feel, and the people with the most severe adrenal fatigue will also have they'll also have a tenderness there. I'm sorry, they'll have a slight muscle splinting over that particular area. Now, that's not due to the erector spinae hypertonicity. That muscle that goes right across there is called the erector spinae. And so if they have back problems, for example, some people could have a tightness in there, but it's not due to that. It's actually from muscles that are deeper in there. So as they breathe out, you press down once again with about 10 pounds of pressure, and you'll find, yeah, those adrenals do hurt on the most severe kind of adrenal fatigue. Now, as you treat them, then you can redo these tests, both the questionnaire and the clinical test, and you'll find that indeed those improve, that the blood pressure starts rising when they stand up after taking their blood pressure when they're lying and standing up, that the eye holds its contraction and at 2 minutes is still nice and tight or only slightly fluctuates, that there's no white line, it's called the white line of Saint-Jean, that appears there, and when you turn them on their tummy, when you press, the adrenals are no longer tender when you push on them again. Now, you can also do laboratory tests. The best laboratory to test, so we won't get into the other ones, but the best laboratory test, something called salivary hormone testing. Hormones that are made from cholesterol are called steroid hormones.
Mm-hmm.
And all the adrenal hormones from the outside part of the adrenal, the cortex, where chronic stress is mediated, are steroid hormones. So they're all made from cholesterol. And those are best tested. The most sensitive place to test those, of the common ones, is in the saliva. So the nice thing is there's 12, 15 labs in the United States that you can test. You can just go to saliva testing or saliva test on the internet, and you're going to find 12 or 15 labs that you can send off for a kit, and they'll have you test. And the most common way to test, and the good test, is to take cortisol test by spitting in a tube 4 times a day. So you spit in about 45 minutes after you rise, around noontime, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and before you go to bed at night. And then you can get those reports back. Now, that's another thing you can see. As people get better, then you will also see those cortisol levels rise. As a matter of fact, I've had some people that have been taking the correct supplements, and their cortisol levels were really low when they first started taking them, and they called me in a panic, says, "Oh, my cortisol levels are still too high." So we went over their lifestyle, and we found out that, they're still burning the candle at both ends and all these other things are happening. I said, you know what? Now what's happening? Your cortisol is finally up because your adrenals finally have the strength to respond as they should, and you're having appropriate high cortisol levels because you're still pushing yourself. You're still challenging yourself. You haven't changed your life. You've got stress, and your adrenals are simply now responding to it.
Right. And
So
high levels of cortisol, I mean, it's great in an emergency, but not something you want to live with elevated cortisol in your blood all the time.
that's right. And what I'm saying, though, the interpretation of that test isn't, quit taking the supplements. It's change your lifestyle, get the stress down, because now, even though your adrenals clap and give thanks because the adrenals are finally able to respond, but this isn't a lifestyle you want because your adrenals are still having to go 90 miles a minute. You want them to have a little relaxation here. So change your lifestyle. And once you change your lifestyle, then you redo your salivary cortisol test. Then your adrenals are going to show normal. You're going to show normal DHEA and normal cortisol.
So for people that haven't gotten their adrenals in trouble yet, but what are some of the things that somebody can do to avoid getting themselves in this mix to begin with?
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Getting 8 hours of sleep or more is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So getting 8 hours of sleep is important. Another is when you feel yourself tired, rest if it is all possible. A third thing is stay away from junk foods. Why? Because junk foods, you've probably heard them referred to as empty calories. And the reason for that is that they eat up the nutrients in order to be metabolized. So you take in sugar and white flour products, which compose junk foods, and they used to contain a lot of nutrients when they used to be the flour of whatever, whether we're talking about wheat flour, oat flour, or corn flour, or rice flour. They used to have a lot of nutrients wrapped around them when they were in their original state as a grain.
Mm-hmm.
But they've been stripped away now, and so they only have energy. So every time you have something that's just have white sugar or white flour in it, then you're calling on the body to take up its reserves of all the nutrients it takes to metabolize that into energy. And there are quite a few. You use B vitamins more, you use more vitamin C. There are quite a few minerals you use: manganese, magnesium, vanadium, chromium. Those are only some of the minerals. You use a lot of magnesium, by the way. And so you can have foods that are high in green vegetables, high in nutrient contents, green vegetables, sprouts, beans, seeds, nuts, animal foods. And I know there's some vegans out there, some vegetarians. I was a vegan for 9 years. I understand. I had absolutely no animal foods, no butter, no cheese, anything for 9 years. I don't think it's a very wise thing to do in North America because we just don't have the food sources that allow us to do that.
So, with as much as 2/3 of the population falling under this umbrella, why is there the controversy over whether this is a real phenomenon or not? There are people that say there is no such thing categorically as adrenal fatigue. What is it that they're responding to?
I'm not saying that 2/3 of people at this moment have adrenal fatigue in the United States. I'm saying about 2/3 of the people at some time in their life experience adrenal fatigue.
Yeah. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
what's the basis of the controversy?
Well, a lot of things that Dr. Leo Roy, one of my mentors, said doctors are down on things they're not up on. And I say this is very true here, that they're not familiar with even what cortisol does, let alone how it functions. And of the doctors who do see this, and there's a growing number, they're in the thousands now, where they used to be in the tens. The ones that see that, they say, I don't see how I could have missed this in my practice for such a long time. They're just not looking for it. And they're taught that the only real thing they have to look for in low adrenal function is Addison's disease. Addison's disease, it destroys the adrenals. It can be a medical emergency, and it's a life-threatening situation. Whereas this is not life-threatening, and people can still function. They still drag themselves through life. And so they've been taught that the only thing that low adrenal functions, except for the very rare autosomal recessive gene that produces different adrenal problems, is Addison's disease. And so they don't think there's anything wrong with someone except ones that have Addison's disease. And of course, these people don't have Addison's disease. And so how can I say it? Medicine's a little bit over 100 years behind on this one, and there's not a lot of interest in it. Why? I don't know whether you realize it, but the majority of doctors are mainly educated by the drug companies.
Yeah.
They write their textbooks, they build their buildings, they conduct all their postgraduate courses, and you might sit back and wonder, with all the different healing modalities, why is it our doctors only use drugs, surgery, and radiation? And if you're anything but a specialist, you just use drugs. That's the only therapy you have. When there's all these other therapies that other cultures and traditional practices have, well, that's not by accident. And so if there's not a drug for it, there's no reason to hype it or to bring it to the doctor's attention.
Thank you very much to Dr. James Wilson. Once again, putting the fear of God in me about how I oftentimes shortchange my own sleep. We will have an upcoming sleep episode to it. This is another one of these long overdue topics that I've really wanted to cover on this show is just really diving into sleep. It's one of these themes that kind of keeps cropping up time and time again that pretty much nobody's got anything bad to say about sleep. I want to get the counterpoint to sleep. Somebody's like, you don't need any sleep. Come on, what are you talking about, kids? But so far that expert has yet to come out from the woodwork. So once again, thank you to Dr. Wilson. And now let's move on to the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Now, as promised in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, something we haven't done in quite some time, a giveaway. We've got a Smart Drug Smarts giveaway of smart drugs. In this case, it's something called Green Tea Focus from greentfocus.com, not surprisingly, is a blend of caffeine and L-theanine in 100 milligrams of caffeine to 200 milligrams of L-theanine capsules. That is the 1-to-2 ratio that's been found in studies to be the optimal, exciting you with the caffeine while chilling you out with the L-theanine combo, which is actually about the opposite ratio of what naturally exists in green tea, if I remember correctly. So this is one of those weird cases where the pill might be better for you than the naturally occurring substance. So how to get your grubby mitts on this stuff? Well, the obvious choice is greentfocus.com, but for the purposes of this giveaway, we're going to look at anybody who signs up between right now and the next time that we publish a podcast episode, which should be next week, on smartdrugsmarts.com. Just signing up for the mailing list, that will get you in the running for a bottle of Green Tea Focus, actually 3 bottles of Green Tea Focus that will be mailed out over the course of the next week. So if you hit www.smartdrugsmarts.com and look for the little sign me up thing in the upper right on the main page, that'll get you into the running, and we'll try not to bombard your inbox with too much obnoxious stuff. Actually, we've been massively underutilizing our mailing list so far, so the chances of being bombarded are slim to none. By the way, for the purposes of full disclosure, I said at the beginning of the episode that I had absolutely nothing psychoactive in my system. That has now been completely turned upside down. I've had caffeine, some more fish oil, and the Siltep stack recommended by the Natural Stacks guys, all while I've been sitting here recording these segments. So, day's off to a good start. And that is the episode. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends and or leave us a review on iTunes. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything we talked about here. I'll be back at you next week with my unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smart podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smart should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.